Today we're going to learn how to solve equations that use cube and square roots. And before we get started, I want to make sure there are a couple of things that we remember. First of all, make sure you remember how to use your handy-dandy calculator. There is a video, another video on our website in case you need help with that, to be able to solve cube and square roots. And then the main thing we need to remember is about how to solve equations. And in 6th and 7th grade, you learned about a little thing called inverse operations. Remember, inverse is just a fancy word for opposite. And I'm going to solve just a really basic equation. I know you guys can do this in your head, but just as a reminder for exactly how inverse operations works. So remember that when we're solving any equation, our goal is to get that variable by itself. And we get that variable by itself or isolate it by getting rid of any pesky little stuff that happens to be with it. So in this case, I've got a plus 2. And I'm going to use inverse operations, which is a minus 2, because a minus 2 is opposite of a plus 2, in order to be able to get rid of that x. However, I also need to remember that if I subtract 2 from one side of my equation, remember there's my dividing line right there at the equal sign, I also have to subtract 2 from the other side of my equal sign. So x is equal to 6. So that's the first thing we need to remember as far as solving equations. The other thing we need to make sure we remember is that we've been learning this week that squaring and cubing numbers have opposites. So when you are cubing a number, I don't know why I wrote an equal sign there, sorry. It's opposite, okay, the opposite of cubing is to do the cube root. The opposite of squaring is to take a square root. So just like adding and subtracting are opposites, multiplying and dividing are opposites, cubing and cube roots are opposites, and squaring and square roots are opposites. Now that we've activated that background knowledge, let's look at some practice problems. With question number 1, and I'm going to actually scoot it over here to the side a little bit so that I have a little bit more room. I need to get this equation so that I've got just an x by itself on one side and a number on the other. In other words, so that the x is isolated. Some people take a look at this and say, oh, but that x is already by itself. But that's actually not true because of this little squared exponent right here. It really means x times x, because it's x multiplied by itself twice. So that's really 2 x's and not just 1 x. So the same way that we used adding or subtracting, multiplying or dividing to cancel out operations when we're solving equations, we also need to use opposite or inverse operations to cancel out an x squared. Remember from our previous conversation, well, not a conversation, but I reminded you that x squared and square roots are the opposite of each other. So in order to cancel out this x squared, I would take the square root of x squared. So taking the square root of it kind of cancels out the x squared since they're opposite. So then I'm just going to have a plain old x now. Now, just like when we're solving equations like normal, if I do something to one side of the equation, I got to do it to the other side too. So I square rooted the left-hand side of my equation. Now I'm going to square root the right-hand side of my equation. The square root of 36 is 6. Please remember also that when you're dealing with square roots, you have a positive and a negative square root, because positive 6 times positive 6 is 36, but also negative 6 times negative 6 is 36. So I'm not just going to have a positive 6 for my answer, I'm also going to have a negative 6 for my answer. Number 2 is just a pretty straightforward, we can do that on our calculator. It's asking us to find the cube root of 27. Remember, on our calculator, to find the cube root, you do math, the math button, and then pick option 4. So if you do math, option 4, and then just you get your square root key. Let me go ahead and show you a little bit here, actually. So if I do math, oh, it came off. Hold on. There we go. I left it alone too long. So math, and then see right here at option 4 is my cube root. Type in 27, hit enter. There I go. The cube root of 27 is simply a 3. Number 3 is another one that we can really just type into our calculator. It's a cube root, so I'm going to do math. Scroll down to 4. There's my cube root symbol. And I'm going to make sure I remember to include this negative. So I'm going to do negative. Sorry, my calibration's off a little bit on my calculator, so it's not lining up right. 1, 2, 5. Hit enter. Square root, or the cube root of negative 125 is simply this negative 5 that you see right here on the screen. Now we're going to move into no, we're not going to move into word problems. We are going to, in number 4, order these numbers in order from least to greatest. Not too terrible, because again, we are going to be able to use our calculator. So I'm going to use my calculator first to figure out what decimal equivalent these numbers are. So I've got square root of 136, which I'm just going to type into my calculator by doing second, x squared, and then the square root button. Okay, that gives me 11.7, if I'm rounding it correctly. Okay, or about 11.7 is fine. For the second one, I'm going to do the cube root of 800. So if I do... Oops, sorry, I had to pause that for a second because I had a visitor, so I forgot where I left off. But I'm going to put in, so I'm just going to say the cube root of 800. Remember on my calculator, I just need to hit math 4 on my calculator and then put in 800. The cube root of 800 is around 9.3. I happen to just know the cube root of 64 is 4 because I know that 4 times 4 times 4 is 64. And then finally, I'm going to do the square root of 50 with my calculator and get 7.1. So if I'm putting these in order from least to greatest, it's the cube root of 64. I've got a radical 50, the cube root of 800, and then finally the biggest one is 136. Now we get to start on word problems. So I am going to underline remember our C-U-B-E-S? I like to skip to underlining the question because it helps me to figure out exactly what the key numbers are that I need. So it says find the approximate length of the edge, and it looks like it's talking about a cube. So I underline the question. My next step is to circle my key numbers. So my volume is 80 feet cubed. I'm going to box that volume. So I'm trying to find the approximate length of the edge. So don't laugh at me for this cube I'm getting ready to draw because it's not good, but you still get the idea. So remember from 7th grade that to find the volume of a cube, you do length times width times height. So I'm going to write that right here, that length times the width times the height of this cube. If I multiply it all together, it gives me 80. Well, because it's a cube, we know that all of the edges are the same. So the length times the width times the height is actually going to be the same number. So I'm multiplying the same number 3 times. Well, to figure out what number multiplied 3 times gives you 80, look no other than to the cube root. If I take the cube root of 80, that will tell me what number multiplied 3 times gives you 80. So I'm going to do that on my calculator, and I'm going to write it over here because I kind of ran out of room over here on the right side. It is approximately 4.3 feet. For number 6, it is asking what is the volume. So I'm going to write here that my volume is length times width times height, because that's what I'm trying to figure out is the volume. I see in my question that my cube, the edge, is 12.6 inches long. Because it's a cube, that means that the length, width, and height are all 12.6 inches. So I'm going to do 12.6 times 12.6 times 12.6, or 12.6 to the third power will work as well. If I multiply that together, that gives me 2,000.4 inches, and this is volume, so it'll be inches cubed. Number 7, so we've got a square, and we're trying to find its area. So I'm going to circle. It says the side is 21 inches. So I've got a square, and the length of the side is 21 inches. We remember from 7th grade that the area is base times height, and because it's a square, if the base is 21, that means the height is going to be 21 also. So I'm going to do 21 times 21, or in other words, 21 squared. Multiply that together, I get 441 inches, and because I'm doing area, it is squared. Last word problem of the day. I've got a problem that is asking me, it looks like I've got a square, and it's asking me what is the appropriate side length of the edge. So I'm going to draw a square. It tells me that the area is 150, and again it's asking me to find the edge. As we'll recall from the previous problem, to find the area of a square, you do base times height. So if I multiply the base times height of this square, I'm going to get 150. Because it is a square, the base and the height are the same length. So a mystery number times itself is going to give me 150. So to figure out what number times itself twice gives me 150, I will take the square root, because the square root is the opposite of squaring something. So I'm just going to punch into my calculator here. The square root of 150 is approximately 12.2 feet. And I'm sorry, this is kind of smushed in there a little bit. I started running out of room.